Welcome to the Housing Agency's video series on the Part 5 legislation. This is one of 5 videos on Part 5 of the Planning and Development Acts 2000 to 2021. This video will explore the key principles of Part 5, starting with the question, what is Part 5? The basic principle behind Part 5 is that a grant of planning permission results in a land value increase. For example, if you take a piece of land with no planning permission and no hope of getting planning permission, that has a certain value. If that land were to be granted planning permission, its value would increase significantly. The difference in these two values is known as the planning gain or the betterment value. Part 5 is intended to capture a portion of this value increase for the state and use it to deliver social and affordable housing in private developments. This is achieved through an agreement with the local authority to deliver land or housing. The local authority is required to include a Part 5 planning condition in grants of planning permission for all applicable developments. This planning condition requires the applicant for planning or the developer to enter into a Part 5 agreement with the local authority before lodging a commencement notice. What are the options to comply with Part 5? There are 5 options to comply with Part 5 and allow for the capture of 20% of the planning gain by the local authority. The local authority and the developer must agree on which option to use. The primary option envisaged by the legislation is the transfer of land. If this option is chosen, the developer simply transfers 20% of the land to the local authority. The local authority pays for the land at existing use value. Existing use value is defined in legislation, but essentially is the value of the land without the benefit of planning permission and without the hope value of getting planning permission. Existing use value is generally below market value, often substantially below, and by purchasing 20% of the land at existing use value, the local authority captures 20% of the planning gain. Instead of the sale of land, the local authority and the developer can agree on one of the alternative options to satisfy Part 5. These are transfer of completed houses on-site, transfer of houses off-site, leasing of houses on or off-site, or combinations of the above, including the transfer of on-site land. The key with the alternative options is that the local authority must achieve the equivalent of 20% of the planning gain. These options are explored in more detail in the 3rd video in this series. What is the Part 5 requirement? The legislation requires that Part 5 must be satisfied by the transfer of 20% of the land or through one of the alternative options, except where the transition arrangements set out in Section 96(3)(j) of the Act apply. These arrangements were introduced in the Affordable Housing Act 2021. They are in place until the 31st of July 2026 and allow for a 10% Part 5 requirement in 2 circumstances. Firstly, where the land has planning permission before the 3rd of September 2021, which is the date on which the legislation was commenced. Or secondly, where the land was purchased when the Part 5 requirement was 10% and a planning permission is granted before the transition arrangements end on the 31st of July 2026. The Part 5 requirement is determined by the date of the grant of planning permission and the date of land purchase. Planning permissions granted before the new legislation was commenced on the 3rd of September 2021 will continue to have a 10% Part 5 requirement. Planning permissions granted after that date will either have a 10% or 20% requirement, depending on the date the site was purchased. Prior to the 1st of September 2015, the Part 5 requirement was 20%. The price paid for the land would have accounted for this. Therefore, if the land was purchased before the 1st of September 2015, any new planning permission for housing will have a 20% Part 5 requirement. From the 1st of September 2015 until the announcement of the new legislation in July 2021, those purchasing land would have priced it on the expectation of a 10% Part 5 requirement. Therefore, it's appropriate that new planning permissions granted would have had a 10% Part 5 requirement, although this will end on the 31st of July 2026. Land purchased after the announcement of the new legislation would have accounted for a 20% Part 5 requirement, and therefore the requirement on new planning permissions will be 20%. planning permissions for residential developments which are granted after the transition arrangements end on the 31st of July 2026 will have a 20% Part 5 requirement. This diagram is based on a Housing Agency infographic on the 2021 changes to Part 5 and is available through the link in the description of this video. Does Part 5 apply to all developments? Part 5 applies to all residential developments, regardless of zoning, except in the following circumstances. The provision of houses by an approved housing body, where the AHB is the applicant for planning permission. Where the AHB is purchasing housing from a private developer, there is still a Part 5 requirement. Part 5 does not apply to the development of houses under a Part 5 agreement, or to the conversion of an existing building where 50% of the exterior is retained. Part 5 does not apply to carrying out works on an existing house. No exemption certificate is required in any of these circumstances. The applicant should refer to section 96.13 in their planning application, and the planning authority will determine if it applies. What is an exemption certificate? Part 5 applies to all residential developments except those just mentioned on the previous slide. However, in certain circumstances, a prospective applicant for planning may apply for an exemption from Part 5. These are developments consisting of 4 or fewer houses or sites of 0.1 of a hectare or less. It is important to note that the applicant must apply for and be granted an exemption certificate from the planning authority. The purpose of the system of exemption certificates is to avoid project splitting to circumvent Part 5, and therefore this exemption from Part 5 is not automatic. We hope you found this video useful. Here are links to the other 4 videos in this series.